What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Today I'm talking with Richard Carrier about a somewhat recent, discussion between the Bible History Skeptics, that YouTube channel, and Tim O'Neill. He says a lot of things in it that are wrong, especially concerned with mythicism, but as well as other historical things. Today we're going to be really focusing on the mythicism portion of it, and everything like that. So Richard here is gonna go through this because both of us are brought up in this, more so you than me, but we're going to be discussing this today. So if you're interested in that, then please stay tuned. All right. Well, hi, Richard. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Nice to be here.
Where do you want to start off first? Because this was like a 3-hour discussion that they had.
I know, my God. Yeah, it was quite long. It was a bit difficult to get through it all. Because like half of it, maybe even more than half of it, are about other subjects, right? So there's a whole section on the history of science. There's a section on, they talk about the Library of Alexandria. And these are things I would love to talk about on some other occasion, perhaps. But because they say some things that are correct, but they also say some things that are incorrect. And it's similar to what they do when they get to the Jesus historicity stuff, too. So to get to that stuff, specifically, I have to say, like, in general, watching this video, I was impressed at how polite and reasonable Tim O'Neill came across as. He doesn't come across at all as the vitriolic ad hominem spewing liar that he is on his blog, right? So he's a very different person when he's talking as opposed to when he's writing, I should say.
In my experience with Tim, it's more or less been the audience that he's speaking with, because like he's the exact same kind of person on his blog as he is like on Twitter and other medium when he's discussing directly with like mythicists. But if he's talking with somebody that's, vehemently anti-mythicist, then he's a fine guy. He's like, he's somewhat reasonable, I guess.
Right. No, it's it's funny. There's some irony in there because he starts out talking about how, and there are things I agree with that he talks about. So one of the examples of this is he talks about how a lot of mythicists, and I don't mean the scholars, I mean the people who are fans of this, like on the internet and so on. A lot of people who are very pro-mythicist, especially very in-your-face about it, are these ex-fundamentalists who come from a tradition where they realize that they've been lied to their whole lives and manipulated, and so they have extreme and deep distrust of the church and of Christianity, and so they jump to the opposite, is that, it must all be lies then, right? So there's this attractiveness to mythicism because it fits right into their narrative of, yeah, they've been lying to me this whole time, of course they'd be lying about that, right? So there is a psychology that I agree is true, which is why I wasn't a mythicist. I was anti-mythicist for many, many years. It took a while for me to actually realize that once you clear away the bad arguments and the bad evidence, there's still enough left to actually have a reasonable doubt left over. The point I want to make is that he was arguing that there's this black and white fallacy that people go through, that they figure like it's either all true or all false. And then he's posing himself as like the reasonable middle ground guy who is like, well, no, actually there's some is true and some is false and stuff. That's ironic because he does exactly the same thing on everything else. So like he himself sees like the history of science question as black and white. The Library of Alexandria question is black and white. It's either all true or all false, when really the sensible middle position is the one I've been advocating, right? And that he gets completely wrong. So he actually is guilty of the exact same fallacy and the exact same errors of reasoning than the people that he's criticizing. And he does this with mythicism too, where he like will criticize the extremists like Joseph Atwill, and then conflate those people with people doing peer-reviewed scholarship on it, like myself or Raphael Lataster, for example. So his blindness to the fact that he's committing the same errors that he accuses other people of doing is as amusing and frustrating at the same time.
So I noticed one thing that they said in that is, and I want to say it didn't come from Tim O'Neill necessarily, but it came from Chris. And he said that newer atheists are like jumping at the extremes like you were talking about and just believing it without actually investigating. I mean,
and I have to say I can attest to this because I used to be a fundamentalist Baptist young Earth creationists. So coming out of it, and this is only within a year. This is only a year ago.
Okay.
I came out of it, and it's like you feel a draw. You do feel a draw to go into the extreme other way, because it's like everything you believed, everything you thought you knew is not true. I mean, the Noah's flood story, 6 days of creation, the earth being between 6 and 10,000 years old. Everybody knows there's a God.
Yeah.
The true God.
Yeah.
And I have to say, Jesus mythicism was looking appealing to me. I was not fully immersed in it.
Do you find that there's any kind of like truth to that? Do you find that people are like jumping into the whole, oh, well, Jesus isn't real kind of thing?
Well, some people are, and probably the loudest and angriest people are. But this is the fallacy, right? This is another fallacy. The assumption that, so there are people, let's take atheism, for example. There are people who are atheists for completely irrational reasons, like completely fallacious reasons. But that doesn't mean that atheism is false, right? So like just because you can find someone using a fallacious argument to get to a conclusion does not tell you whether that conclusion is actually true or false. You actually have to independently look at the evidence in a rational way to decide that. And that's what happened to me, right? So I know many, like you look at the Akaria S., the Dorothy Murdoch and the Joseph Atwill crowd, like not just them, but also their weird cultic fanatical followers. They have this kind of extremist, sort of irrational, fallacy jumping, conspiracy mongering attitude towards all of this. But once you throw away all of the irrationality and all the fallacies, there is still something left over, and that's so it's a fallacy in and of itself to assume, oh yeah, look at the fallacies they're committing, therefore their conclusion is false. That's actually not a valid way to reason. So you actually have to review the evidence, look at it over again, and say, okay, does anything hold up? And there is a kernel of it that does, and that's what I've published on and so on. And I don't see O'Neill coherently getting the difference between these two things at all. He just doesn't seem to see the difference between them. Or Chris or Bryan, for that matter.
I mean, they seem to be very bad at like detecting the nuances between the two positions. Because I know at one point, and I found this spectacularly hilarious, is at the very beginning of the interview or the video, you have both Chris and Bryan, I guess is his name. They're talking. They're giving like these very crude like analogies to mythicism, right? Like mythicism is like an aged hooker. Then the other guy is like mythicism is like cocaine.
So HistoryNet says mythicism is about as attractive as an aged hooker. So my reply is this: some hookers age well, though. Just saying.
Yeah, I love you, HistoryNet, but here's the problem: is that in this case, mythicism's not really an aged hooker, more cocaine.
Okay. Yes.
You snort it; it's really good, but it's really bad for you too.
Yeah, it feels good in the moment until you wake up the next day, and then you find out, oh shit, it was a lot of fish scale in that.
But then later on in the interview, I believe it was Tim O'Neill who said mythicism isn't a bad idea.
It might be that it's all non-historical, and I will never say that mythicism is out of the question. I've come across Christians who say, oh, it's a ridiculous idea. It's not a ridiculous idea. It's not the best idea, but it's not a ridiculous one. It's absolutely possible that they could have invented Jesus, or that Jesus could have developed, the idea of a historical Jesus could have developed out of earlier other ideas such as an allegorical Jesus or a celestial Jesus or a pagan amalgam Jesus.
And it's kind of like these these different contrasting things, because it's like either it's an aged hooker on cocaine or it's not a bad idea. And it just seems very odd.
Well, this is one of the things I know. I mean, he says, and I got quotes, like he says, I would never say mythicism is out of the question. He says it's absolutely possible. He says it's not a ridiculous idea. Like, he actually said these things. And he says that he only holds that it's not the best idea, which I find weird, because that's not at all the position you see on his blogs. Like, his blogs is it is absolutely ridiculous idea. All of it is ridiculous. Everyone is incompetent who even suggests it. So he has this extremist position on his blog, but in this video, he's like, oh, no, it's possible. I just don't think it really like holds up in the end, right? That's not the position he takes normally in public. So that surprised me, like you said. That was odd. And I think Chris and Bryan kind of like blew right past that and didn't really explore it further. But there's a lot of examples in there where Chris and Bryan are not even reading the text correctly. And we'll get to that, I think. But I have to correct one thing that comes up early in the video. This is weird. I think it was Chris, criticizes my book for being expensive, meaning On the Historicity of Jesus, which is the first peer-reviewed monograph ever published arguing that maybe Jesus didn't exist. And it's published by Sheffield Phoenix off of the campus of University of Sheffield.
I couldn't afford Carrier, so I went to David Fitzgerald and got some. Yes. Yes.
So the bargain basement being Carrier. David.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I was cheap. I couldn't afford $80 for one book, so I bought the $7 to $10 book on Kindle.
Fair enough.
They say it's too expensive. They say it's $80, and I'm like, what the hell are they looking at? It's $35 in paperback for people. It's $21 on Kindle, FYI, and reasonably priced on Audible, read by me. So like this idea that it's an expensive book, it's weird for two reasons. One, it's false. Like, why can't they even get like basic economic facts about my book correct? But also, it's like they don't know that outrageously expensive books is the norm in academia now. It's actually a serious problem in academia. These major books come out for like $100, $150 list prices. They're outrageously priced. And that's normal in peer-reviewed academic monographs now. And I'm outraged by that. And in fact, when that was gonna happen to me at Sheffield Phoenix, I wrote them a letter making it like this social justice argument. It's like, you are cutting this knowledge off from the poor. Can we either just ditch the hardcover altogether, or can we have a simultaneous release of the hardcover and the softback? And they agreed to the simultaneous release, and so from day one, the softback, the cheaper softback that's $35 is still a little pricey, but this is, academic monographs tend to be pricey because they have yeah.
Well, yeah, and I mean, a couple of things to bring up here. We also have the Crestus app that we're constantly updating that isn't as extensive as the book, but it does give like a good, quick reference, for any kind of question that you might have, for one. For two, Raphael Lataster actually released his book this year, and it was targeted to academia and everything like that, and that was priced at like $200. So
that's right. No, that's a very typical price. That's the thing. So that's an example of an outrageously priced book. So, but even mine, the hardback is $90, which it may be $80 if you find it on discount somewhere. But you don't have to buy the hardback. You can get the softback for $35. You can get a used version. You can get the Kindle for $21. So this kind of does but they do this a lot where they get basic facts wrong and then sort of laugh about it like they're mocking me about oh, how dare he have this high price, and showing total ignorance of how academics works and showing total ignorance of what even the price of my book is. And it might seem like a trivial point, but it's actually paradigmatic of the entire video. They do this repeatedly where they get fundamental facts wrong and then laugh about it like they're the superior, haughty, knowledgeable ones, which it's kind of funny actually to watch. But anyway, we should get into more substantive stuff of what's going on with mythicism. Yeah.
Before we get into the dying and rising God thing that they discuss, this happens in every single anti-mythicist discussion. They compare mythicism with young Earth creationism, and I'm wondering if you can give your thoughts on that.
I just dismiss those comparisons. Those are ridiculous comparisons, because if we had the evidence for Jesus that we have for evolution by natural selection, this wouldn't be a debate. So the absurdity is that they're basically, by using that analogy, they are claiming that we have the same scale and quality of evidence in both cases, and we clearly do not. So either they're delusional or they're dishonest. There's no way that you can think that is an apt comparison. Another one they always do, people who are critics will do the Holocaust as another example, which is more a closer analogy because at least it's a historical claim. But that's the same case. If we had we have vast evidence for the Holocaust. It's just crazy, huge amount of documentation, firsthand documentation, tons of we can actually talk to eyewitnesses now. They're still alive. The evidence for it is huge. We don't have any of that for the historicity of Jesus. So the analogy is bullshit. And so I don't know. I'm really suspicious of the motives of anyone who would use these analogies. They clearly are not aware of the actual difference in evidence, or they don't care. about evidence. Like, right, so they're just arguing from prestige. It's like, well, everybody believes this. How dare you suggest that it's not true? Like, that's the same kind of like false narrative. So I find that annoying. But they didn't go into that too much, so I'm not really going to dig on them on that too much. I think they made like one offhand comparison in there.
No, yeah, they did. I didn't mean to make it out to be like they say that all the time, but whenever like I'm in discourse like on Twitter or elsewhere online, I always get that comparison thrown in my face. So I was kind of curious as to how you handle that. My particular thing is to just dismiss that altogether because it's like ridiculous. But again, I just was curious how you handled it. But
I always love just school them on logic, right? To say, okay, look, you're making an argument from analogy. Okay, what has to happen for this to be a valid argument? The pieces have to be analogous, and so like let's look at the scale of evidence. Are they analogous? Well, no. So why are you making this argument? Why? But I always like to get people's motives. Like, why did you even think that was a good argument? Like, why did it even occur to you to make that argument? What's wrong with you? Like, don't you know the difference in evidence? Like, do you not understand that, or do you not care what the difference in evidence is? Why would you think it's a valid analogy to use? So if people throw that at me, I go at it. I like really try to analyze, like, why did you even make that argument just now? Because like we can walk you through it, and you yourself will agree that it's a bad argument. So why did you do it? So that's what I like to do. And then of course, if people are watching, you get a lot of people now understand how arguments from analogy work and how not to make an argument from analogy. So you've actually accomplished something. So that's how I normally would deal with those kinds of arguments. And I'll say also, to be fair though, like they do like when they do criticisms of Joseph Atwill in there, or even Robert Price, when Price argues that the letters of Paul are entirely forgeries. I agree with them. I think these are not believable arguments, although they have more plausibility than creationism by far. But that doesn't mean that they're credible enough that we should actually buy into them. So there does seem to be like a lot of unawareness of nuance of degrees of belief, right? So like even the creationist analogy doesn't work even for Atwill's theory, and Atwill's theory is batshit crazy, right? So like it's still more plausible than creationism, which involves giant sky gods and massively forged geological evidence and just the most Star Trek level kind of deception. Like the creationism is an absurd theory on a level that even Atwill's argument is not that absurd. It still is absurd. It's just not that absurd. Like, so the analogy doesn't even work for bad mythicism, much less like sound mythicism. But I do agree with them that those extreme positions that they do attack, they're right. And when they talk about, for example, parallelism, Jesus has these parallels to all these gods. They're right. There's tons of bad parallel arguments out there, like the Jesus and Horus comparison, the god Horus. That's almost entirely bogus. It's almost entirely bullshit. It was made up by Arcaria S., probably earlier people before her that she gets from the 19th century because she practically never read a modern scholar that wasn't dead before the 1900. But so there's lots of that. So they're right to criticize those kinds of just sort of arbitrary, weakly fact-based parallelism. A lot of those parallels didn't even exist. They're just made up. And even the ones that do exist are probably not significant. So to do parallel arguments, to talk about like cultural diffusion and cultural influence, which we do in every other religion, people accept this as a thing. You don't do it the way that the amateurs are doing it, but also you don't do it the way that O'Neill and these guys are doing it either. They completely dismiss this idea as if it's not relevant to scholarship, when in fact, in every other religion we study, we readily accept influences of things like this. So we look at, for example, the influence of Babylonian and Sumerian mythology on the Old Testament. We look at, there's a lot of the surrounding Middle Eastern cultures had flood myths that you could really just see. They're just reading right in. The Old Testament is an evolution of those, a rewrite of them, essentially. Because it's all part of the local culture and it all evolved from the same thing. They wouldn't doubt that. They wouldn't laugh at that. They would say like, oh yeah, okay, there's definitely like influence of these flood myths went around. They got molded differently in different places. We totally accept that. But as soon as you're talking about Jesus, now suddenly it can't happen. It's ridiculous. No one would ever suggest this. That's just not like an honest appraisal of how scholarship works or how it should work. So if you're going to look at parallelism, you got to do it validly. There's a valid way to do it, and that's what I do on the Historicity of Jesus, which we might get to some examples of that.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with next is the dying and rising God portion, because Chris said that you don't do anything with the dying and rising God motif, and that it purely exists to pad runtime.
My favorite ones are dying and rising gods, and
Yeah.
particularly because of the way Carrier uses them, and he misattributes when he does it. It's element 31 or whatever in OHJ,
Yeah.
and it's hilarious because he does almost nothing with it in the entire book. It kind of just exists there to pad out runtime.
Yeah, that was so weird. This is another example of how they clearly aren't even reading my damn book. Like, I don't understand why it's so hard for this happens all the time. Like, critics will say, well, this is a ridiculous thing he said. And I was like, I didn't say that. That's not in my book. Like, where are you getting these ideas? Why aren't you interacting with the book? Why aren't you interacting with peer-reviewed scholarship, the actual scholarship? And this is a good example. Like he said, yeah, you're right. I noticed this. He said, I lay out what I call element 31 in chapter 5. It's on page 168 on the Historicity of Jesus. And he says, and there Richard Carrier says that he will reference it again later. And then Chris says, and he never does. He never brings it up. And I was like, okay, this was easy for me to check. And first of all, I remember that. I'm pretty sure I did. I'm pretty sure that's false, but maybe I'm gaslighting myself. Well, it was like, so I checked. You could just easily find the fact that I reference it quite prominently and significantly on pages 212 and 611, both very importantly in integrating them into the theory and how they're relevant. So he makes this, and he laughs at this, like, he never mentions this thing again, how ridiculous. I was like, yeah, I did, and I did it significantly and importantly. We now get to laugh at you for not knowing that, right? So like, this is the kind of sloppy, amateurish behavior, and then they act all haughty like they know better, like I'm the incompetent one, when all they're doing is just displaying incompetence after incompetence after incompetence. And O'Neill didn't correct him, which shows that O'Neill doesn't know that what he said is completely false, which means O'Neill didn't read my book, doesn't understand the argument in it. So that's the kind of thing, like, this is useless criticism if you're not even going to engage what the book actually says. And I find that most frustrating. It's like, these are the videos that people watch, and then they go, oh, yeah, and then they never realize that it's bullshit. Like, they're not even talking about the book. They claim to be. They'll cite page numbers and quote things, but they'll get it entirely wrong what's in there. So you really, really have to go look at the book, and then it's almost like if you just read the book and read it carefully, I don't need to do this interview because you will automatically see everything they're saying is wrong, because you will actually you'll actually go to the source and actually see what's in there. So yeah, that's another example of what I'm talking about. This is sort of arrogant incompetence in dealing with this subject.
Well, I was going to say the benefit of having on the history of Jesus in Amazon Kindle form is that you can read it on the web, and you can do a search in the book for element 31. And beside, there are 16 references to element 31 in the book besides the title for element 31.
Right.
So to say that you don't use it whatsoever, you reference it multiple times. Like, you even reference it before you bring it up. So it's like multiple times throughout the entire book, you reference element 31. I mean, it's one of the bigger parts, at least for me, reading that particular section. Like, I liked reading, your particular section on that. So, I mean, it's really funny to hear them say things that are easily, like, fact-checked and be completely wrong on them.
You're absolutely right. It's the methodology, right? Like, okay, so I see it like all these other critics, like James McGrath and these others, do the same thing. They even Bart Ehrman has done this. Well, they'll want to make an assertion. They're going to say, well, I'm going to say that he's never references it again in the book. Doesn't the little elf in your head say, like, maybe I should check to be sure that's true before I say it, right? Like, that's how, as a scholar, I was trained. That's getting a PhD. That is the thing they teach you to do. It's like, if you're going to make an assertion like that, especially if you're going to make it in a very essential, like, mockingly way, like, he was like, you should check, right? Like, you should, like, is that true? Like, and that's the thing that you do. And if you act that way, like, if your entire methodology is like that, you won't make these mistakes. And yet that's what they do. They don't even, it doesn't occur to them that they should check that what they're saying is true before even making the statement. So that's right. That's one thing. There was another thing, different kind of mistake, is when they go into this long bit about Medinger and Baal and Marduk, without realizing Chris does this, and O'Neill doesn't correct him. So Clearly, O'Neill doesn't know any of this either. It's funny that they talk about, I think they even name a page number, I'm not sure, but they talk about where I discuss Baal and Marduk and cite some scholarship on it. And they try to like mock me for getting scholarship wrong or something like that. And on that page that they're talking about, I explicitly point out that when I'm talking about Marduk, I mean Baal, that they're actually the same god. And I get this from Mettinger. Mettinger's work in other various of Mettinger's works, he actually points out that Baal and Marduk are actually the same god. Baal just means Lord, so it's just a generic name for God. It's like just God.
Kind of like Allah.
Right, exactly. It's like Allah. When we have literature, the scholarship that's talking about Baal, they're usually actually talking about Marduk. At least the way Mettinger is talking about this structure. This is funny. This is funny, not only because the page they're making fun of says this, so they missed that already. So they've already missed that it's Baal and Marduk. There's a point where Chris later on says, oh, the Marduk stuff was ridiculous. Even Mettinger himself says there's no evidence of Marduk rising from the dead. But I think Mettinger's evidence for Baal rising from the dead is really good. And I'm like, that's freaking Marduk, man. So he's contradicting. He doesn't even know they're the same God. And so he's contradicting. One moment he says, no, there's no evidence. Mettinger says there's no evidence. And then in the second he's like, I think Mettinger has got the best evidence for this God rising from the dead. So they're just not paying attention. They're not reading. They're acting like total amateurs when they deal with this. And it's really frustrating for me.
So one criticism that I wrote down that they had was that, of course, they said that Marduk is not a dying and rising god, but they also point out how one of your references, M.S. Smith, denies Baal as a dying and rising god. And I'm kind of curious what you think about that.
Yeah. Let me find the actual. So this is funny too. So they're talking about a footnote that I have in there when I talk about it. The footnote begins, this is an exact quote, previous attempts to deny that these were dying and rising gods have been thoroughly refuted by Trugam Mettinger. Okay. I then cite Mettinger. I then list the previous attempts that he refuted. That's what the note is. So like they think I'm citing Smith as evidence for it. No, I just say in the note, that's not what I'm doing. I'm citing Mettinger, and then I'm citing the people that he refuted. And that's relevant because, as Mettinger points out, the evidence for Mettinger's conclusion is already in those articles. So you really do need to read them. You need to read Smith, and you need to read the others, and then read Mettinger, and then you can see, like, oh, yeah, Mettinger's right. So that's, like, they're not even reading a footnote correctly. They're not reading their sources correctly. They're contradicting each other or themselves about, like, which argument. Okay, so you agree Mettinger refuted Smith on Baal, but at the same time disagree. Like, pick a lane. But anyway, they're just not reading it carefully, right? They're not getting what all the things that they're saying about what's in my book is incorrect, even just like what I'm saying in my footnotes about it. So I just found that really bizarre and frustrating. They can do better than this. It's just, can't you just do a little bit level of like good, competent reading of what's going on here, and even just like it's almost like they come with the assumption, like they're reading the text, they're assuming from the start that it must be incompetent, and therefore they reinterpret everything they're reading, trying to figure out like how can I support my narrative of this, and rather than looking at it as like actually maybe he actually read these things, so why would he cite them? What do you think is going on here? Oh, right, he explains that in the first line of the footnote. Okay, so like trying to actually say like, why do you think I wrote that stuff down? Like, do you think I just didn't read it and just threw it in there? Like, like they have to come up with something. They're not like thinking like, why would I have done this? Like even from the perspective that I have, they can't get into my head and say, why would he have done this? And then they would understand what's going on, which is how you have to read everyone. Like you can't read someone with the assumptions that are contrary to the assumptions of the person who's writing. You have to read what they're writing from the point of view of the person writing it, so in order to understand what they're saying. And so this is another fundamental issue of methodology that they get wrong over and over again. And this is a kind of embarrassing example of that.
They go on.
So yeah, that was.
Yeah, I was going to say, they go on to talk about how Zalmoxis isn't a dying and rising god, citing, I think, one of your sources, Eliot.
Eliad, yeah. Yeah, they do the same thing there, which is weird. Okay, so I cite Eliade because Eliade supports me, actually. Here's the thing. So I don't know exactly. So this is the other thing, is they never clearly said what they think Eliade did say, right? They just say, like, oh, he clearly didn't read Eliade. Eliade refutes this thesis. And they don't, like, specify, like, well, what do you think Eliade said? I suspect what they think he said is that Eliade said, this is what they think he said, that Zalmoxis is what's called a descensus story, a katabasis, which is, in fact, I think they mention katabasis. They throw the word out, but I don't think I can't remember if they go into the detail of, maybe they do, maybe they did in the video. But a katabasis is like the Homer story of Odysseus, where Odysseus goes down to Hades, talks to the dead, and comes back. So it's a visit to the underworld and return, in which there's no, like, Odysseus doesn't have to kill himself to go there, right? He can literally just walk down and walk back up. He never dies. And this is a version of the Descent to the Underworld story. There are also Descent to the Underworld stories that involve actual deaths. We have many examples. In my blog post, Dying and Rising Gods, you can go, it's Dying and Rising Gods, it's Pagan Guys Get Over It, that's the title. You can go there, and I have all the source citations and the scholarship and stuff. And I give many of the examples, and I point out where I've listed the evidence for them. There's tons of examples of actual deaths where someone goes to the underworld, visits there, talks to people, and comes back, their body revives, and that's a resurrection, right? So that's a return from the dead. Both of these stories do the same thing. They serve the same role in religious mythology. But you can say, like, well, okay, we're going to treat them as different, because, Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't walk down to hell and come back up. He has to go through a death, right? So if you want to find what tradition that myth comes from, you've got to look at the death and resurrection versions of this Descent to the Underworld story, right? And so I use Zalmoxis as an example of this. And they're saying that he's not. I think they're trying to claim that Zalmoxis is a Descent to the Underworld story. But that's A, not what Eliade said, and B, that there's no way to do that with the evidence. Because there's two versions of the Zalmoxis story. There's the story that the believers in Zalmoxis told, and then there's the story that the Greeks who made fun of them told, which is the polemical bullshit story, right? It's like saying the Virgin Mary was really raped by a Roman soldier. His name was Panther, which sounds like Parthenos, which sounds like virgin, and that's how they got it. Ha ha ha! That's how they got it wrong. But that's not a belief that the Christians in them had, right? So the Christians didn't believe that Mary was, raped by a Roman soldier. That was a mocking story that people were making fun of the Christian virgin birth story. So this is the same thing with the story that Zalmoxis went and hid in a cave, didn't really go anywhere, and came back and claimed to have visited the land of the dead. That's the bullshit, mocking, polemical story that the enemies of the religion made up. That's not what the Gitai themselves, the actual worshippers of Zalmoxis, taught. And so this is, a lot of critics get this wrong. Lacona got this wrong. Habermas has got this wrong. Apparently O'Neill and Chris are getting it wrong. Like, they're confusing the attackers of Zalmoxianism, their mocking, polemical version of what happened, as if somehow that represents the true belief of the Gitai. But even the mocking version doesn't have Zalmoxis go to hell. Like, he hides in a cave. He doesn't actually go to the underworld. So even that is not a katabasis. So there's no version of the Zalmoxis story that is a katabasis story where he walks down to hell and walks back. There's no version of it. The only version that we have is the version where he says he died, and the version where they said, no, he lied, but which also acknowledges that that's what he claimed to have said, right? So both stories support that Zalmoxis is a dying and rising god. Even the mockers of it, even the ones who are claiming it was a fake death and resurrection, they're at least acknowledging that the belief was a claim of death and resurrection. Their joke requires the assumption that that's what the believers were claiming. So we have multiple corroboration here, even from their enemies, that Zalmoxis was a dying and rising god. So the evidence is clear on this. There's just no way to argue that there's a katabasis narrative in Zalmoxis. So what they're claiming is that Eliade, but Eliade, this is one of my sources that I cite, this great scholar who studied Zalmoxis, he says it's a katabasis, but he doesn't. So here's the thing. Here's what Eliade says about Zalmoxis in the work that I cite, and I'm quoting. I'm going to put Zalmoxis' word in. So he says, the revelation that he, meaning Zalmoxis, brings to the Gitai is communicated through a well-known mythic ritual scenario of death, occultation, and return to earth, epiphany, and features in Zalmoxis' case, quote, the return of Zalmoxis in the flesh. Eliade then compares the story with that of Aristias, which is another dying and rising story. And then he says, quote, Zalmoxis' disappearance, his death, is equivalent to a descensus ad infernos as a means of initiation. A descensus ad infernos, that's Latin for the Greek katabasis, right? So Zalmoxis' disappearance, his death, is equivalent to a descensus ad infernos as a means of initiation. By imitating the divine model, the neophyte undergoes a ritual death precisely in order to obtain the non-death, the immortality which the sources emphasize. So note the key words here. He says equivalent to. He does not say it was a katabasis. He said it was equivalent to a katabasis. So he did not say what they're claiming. He said what I'm claiming. And they're, because they suck at reading, apparently. Like, I can't explain it any other way. Like, they're just clearly not paying attention to what words are actually being said. They're not paying attention to the sources. So it's very sloppy, very shoddy research here. And it's frustrating because, you know, they're doing this and trying to like mock me for doing it badly when they're the ones who are doing it really badly. So what Eliot does in his text is he has this, it's a big long thing about how this is a version of shamanism. And he's the one linking these two types of story, the death and resurrection and the katabasis. And he's saying that these are really two versions of the same thing, which is, and he's like, there's examples of shamans whose souls leave the body and visit the dead. And he says that's exactly the same. It's a third version. There's all these things are the same kind of myth that get versioned in different ways of descents to the underworld. And he ties it into ancient shamanism and stuff like this. It's an interesting bit of religious anthropology. But he never says that Zalmoxis is a katabasis narrative. He's comparing it to a katabasis narrative. And that's the key thing. And he's saying that it performs the same. The death and resurrection of Zalmoxis performs the same function as a katabasis narrative. So anyway, that's where they went wrong on that one. And yeah, they went off a long time going on that. They're just not reading the sources. It's basically the thing.
And a lot of times they reference, when they're talking about the dying and rising gods, it's like they need for these cults to still be in practice after Christ supposedly died or something like that. They also say that we don't find resurrection leftovers from other pagan religions. Like,
even if they're legitimate parallels, it's just ridiculous to try and argue that just because there are legitimate parallels that could actually be connected, that is just this plain and simple derivation. That's just not how religious syncretism works.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's like my biggest argument with dying and rising gods and against their use in this literature, is because when we look at religious syncretism, one of the biggest things that it tends to do is leave leftovers of what was before. Like when for like Yahweh's merging with Baal, we find a lot of leftovers, like Leviathan. We find carbon copies of the Leviathan stories from the Baalic literature.
Yeah, that's also wildly incorrect understanding of how syncretism works. Those are two separate things. So the first of those is that we have no evidence, they claim, that we have no evidence that these dying and rising cults were still active in the time of Christianity, and that's completely false. I cite numerous examples, direct primary evidence examples in on the Historicity of Jesus. If people, and I mentioned them also in on the blog, Dying and Rising Gods, you can see examples. I talk about it in Not the Impossible Faith. I give a whole list of examples. In fact, the dying and rising theme was so popular at the time that in the first century when Christianity rose, that there were people making fun of it, right? That's how common it was. So you had like a joke plays, like body plays, where someone's dog would die and rise from the dead because they're making fun of the theme of dying and rising. They had the Satyricon by Petronius, written in the 60s AD, where the entire epic narrative is this epic narrative of the hero trying to resurrect his dead penis. He's making fun, yes, it's comedy, but he's making fun of the idea of the dying and rising god by equating it to a penis and with impotency rather than immortality. So he's making, so the whole book is making fun of this. So you're not going to be having all this comedy making fun of a thing that no one's talking about. This is evidence that it was actually so popular that it was actually to the point where people are making fun of it. And we have many other examples. We have like serious examples of this. The Syrian Adonis cult was still claiming the death and resurrection of Adonis. The Osiris cult was still claiming the death and resurrection of Osiris. So we have lots of these examples. Romulus cult, there were passion plays about the death and resurrection of Romulus still going on at the time of the origins of Christianity. We have direct eyewitness testimony to this. So So it's just absurd of them to claim that there's no evidence of it. It's also methodologically incorrect to say, for example, they said the Baal cult. So the Baal cult at the Inanna cult, the Inanna Tammuz cult, and the Baal cults that are already, we know, were being worshipped and still practiced in Tyre. Tyre is the ethnic city, a Gentile city that's one of the major ports for commerce into Judea at the time. So in Gospels even have Jesus visit Tyre, right? So we know these cults were going on there. We just don't have any texts that tell us what they believed at that particular time, right? But so you can't say that they weren't still teaching the same dying and rising mythology that they always had, just because we don't have the text. You can't argue from the silence of documents we don't have. So it's actually incorrect methodology to say that, well, they weren't talking about dying and rising Marduk or a dying rising Baal or a dying rising Inanna. For all we know, they were. We have none of the sources have been preserved about it. And it would be highly unlikely, with all the popularity with Osiris cult and Romulus cult and Zalmoxis cult and the Syrian Adonis cult and so on. All of these dying and rising cults are so popular, still going around. It'd be really weird if the most blatant and original of the dying and rising cults, the Inanna cult in particular, being practiced at Tyre, if that cult had dropped the dying and rising theme. Why would they do that? Like, it's popular. Everybody's got it. So of course they're going to have it. So you would sooner make the opposite argument that probably they were. But I'll grant that we don't have proof of that, so we can't use that as evidence. We can only use it as an inference. We need evidence of actual dying and rising cults still going on, but we have that evidence for the other cults. So and there are probably many more. Like Jupiter Dolicanus is the extension of the Marduk Baal religion. It turned into a mystery cult where we have no texts of what the beliefs were of the Jupiter Dolicanus mystery religion. Why would it have dropped the dying and rising theme if that was fundamental to the cult, which it had always been for hundreds of years, as Mettinger shows? So I think it's invalid methodology to use arguments from silence the way they are. They're using them invalidly. They're not engaging in non-fallacious versions of an argument from silence. But we don't have to argue from that. We can just point out we actually, whatever those cults were teaching, we don't know. But we do have enough examples of cults that were teaching the theme. So we know the mytheme was alive and active. So you can't claim we don't have evidence of it. So they're completely wrong to make that statement. And that's another example, I think, where they just didn't even check. Like, I have tons of examples with primary sources. Like, why don't they know any of them? Like, I don't understand why they don't do even just the minimal research on this. It's like they read Jonathan Z. Smith and then didn't actually fact check anything. So anyway, I just get very frustrated when people act this way and don't do the research. If you're going to make claims about this, do the research. Know what you're talking about.
Well, yeah, and I believe like one of the best primary sources you have is Plutarch, in reference to like Osiris, that cult. That's a pretty good source. I know that you mentioned several times in the book. So
and quoted even. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Right. That's a good example. We've got, for Romulus, we have multiple sources, including Plutarch. We've got Cicero and Livy and some others. We've got, and also it's worth pointing out that we don't know if Zalmoxis cult was still active. It probably was. There's no reason to think it wasn't in that time. But what we do know is that Zalmoxis cult is described in this way as a dying and rising cult in Herodotus, who was one of the standard college texts of the time, the equivalent of college. If you went, anyone who learned enough Greek to compose the kind of structured Greek that we see in the Gospels, you had to have gone through this level. It's called rhetorical school, this level of study. The standard corpus for which, the standard textbooks included Herodotus. So we know for a fact everyone who wrote Gospels read Herodotus. It would be highly unlikely for them to have gotten to that level of skill and ability and not to have read any of the standard texts that were taught in schools at the time, and Herodotus is one of them. So we know they know about Zalmoxis cult, regardless of whether it was still being practiced. Paul would be the same, and so would be the same of anyone. If the first apostles, if any of them were educated Greeks, we don't really know that. There's the claim that they were illiterate Galilean Jews. I don't believe that claim. I don't think that's plausible at all. But who knows? We don't really have direct evidence from any of them to know that.
Well, now, so Chris had a field day with one thing that I wrote about Anana and comparing Anana to the Jesus Passion and everything like that. And one thing that he, which isn't in the video that we're talking about, but the Anana thing, they want to act like there's no way for the Jewish people to be influenced in any kind of way, either directly or indirectly, by the Inanna story. But what you say in your book, as well as what you've said here, is that the Inanna Tammuz cult was still being practiced in Tyre, and it seems rather ridiculous to think that people that would have written like the Jesus myth wouldn't have been exposed to those particular cult ideas. So, I mean, I don't know. Do you get that thrown at you a lot usually?
Usually from Christian apologists, because that's a ridiculous, bogus Christian apologetic argument that's completely false and rejected by all mainstream non-fundamentalist scholars, really. No, there's two things there. There's the Gospels, which is different from the origin of the religion. We got to keep those two separate. So the Gospels were clearly written by educated Greeks. So we know they know what any educated Greek would know. So you can't claim that they didn't know about all this stuff. Obviously they did. If they didn't, they couldn't have written Greek like this. So it's like saying someone doesn't know basic things that you learn in college, even though they have a college degree. Right? So it's no, clearly they knew this stuff. So the gospel authors, you can't make that claim for the gospel authors. But usually what they want to say is that, the gospel authors are writing decades later. What they want to say is that, well, this can't have been influenced at the beginning, right? So the origin of the story can't have come from this influence because it came from these poor Galilean illiterate Jews. How could they possibly have known all of this stuff? And we look at all the scholarship for Galilee, even Galilee specifically, much less Judea in general. The extent of influence is vast. They're constantly interacting with Gentiles to the point that Greek was even becoming sort of a commerce language. Even in Galilee, there are Gentile cities in Galilee. There are traders. People come through from Gentile areas to trade in Galilee. This includes religious itinerants, you've got various Gentile religions are in there. You've got cynic philosophers. You've got people coming around and, just try to preach whatever evangelical thing they want to teach, which included a lot of secular philosophies and things. It's all through there. There's no way to argue that they couldn't have been aware of it. It's theoretically possible for some hermit who's sticks to a farm village and never learns how to read and never goes anywhere but his village. Theoretically, it's possible that guy didn't hear about any of this stuff. But you can't make the claim. Well, we can't make a claim that the origins of Christianity started with some hermit in an isolated village who never left the village. First of all, we don't know. We don't know how educated these first guys were. We don't know where they came from. They almost certainly had to be educated rabbis. But we also know that the Galilean sect of rabbinical school was hostile to and different from the Judean Pharisee sect. So there are two different schools of thought here. So that most of when people say the Jews are very hostile to Greek culture, they're talking about Pharisees. But that's one sect. And in fact, it's the sect that the Christians very clearly were the most hostile to. So they clearly didn't come from the Pharisees. So you can't make the argument that they were like Pharisees. They were the opposite of Pharisees. They were anti-Pharisee from the very beginning. I mean, Paul makes this clear and so on. He was a Pharisee, he says, and then he, converted to Christianity, but he was persecuting Christians as a Pharisee. So we know, so you can't start from the example of what Pharisees thought about Greek culture or what kind of education they had or whatever. You have to look at the fringe cults, and you have to look at the countercultural cults. You look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, where there are Greek literature. I think we have a piece of there's a reference to the Enema Elish in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so there's, which is very pagan. So they clearly know this stuff. They know about pagan information. They have Greek language, people who speak and write Greek, among them, educated Greeks. So this idea that there can't have been influence is just false. And that's even apart from when we get to the pilgrims, right? So one of the things about Judaism is that you have a massive influx of pilgrims throughout the year at different times of year for the Yom Kippur and for Passover. And so you have these Jews from the diaspora who are coming from like Alexandria and Corinth and Ephesus, and they're coming from all these where they get exposed to Greek and various foreign cultures. They come en masse, like 1 million people will come into Judea, over the course of a year. These are Jews coming in. Are they just not going to talk about any of the things they heard of? Are they not going to bring any books with them? Are there no libraries in Jerusalem? I mean, it's ridiculous to suggest that there's no possibility of influence. Like, you could, if you wanted to go hunting, find someone who wouldn't know these things. But there are definitely thousands and thousands of people in Judea who would be fully aware of all of these things and therefore subject to influence by them. And so it's a ridiculous argument that's contrary to all we know about the region and all we know about how ideas spread and so on from the time. And I didn't see them bring this up in the video we're talking about. But if they do pull that on you, you can point that out. And I have a section on the Historicity of Jesus all on this. I think it's element 30. And I have, I can't remember, it's somewhere around element 30. There's a few elements where I talk about influence and how scholarship has reacted to the possibility of these influences. So no, it's just that's a non-starter as an argument. No one was being culturally isolationist to that degree. Even the Pharisees weren't, and Pharisees are irrelevant because the Christians didn't come from the Pharisees. So.
Okay. Well, was there any other thing in the dying and rising sort of section that I didn't touch on?
I think we've covered the main things. Oh, the other point that you made, that's what, syncretism. You mentioned two things. One was the idea of leftovers you mentioned. He specifically uses the phrase leftovers. That's not how syncretism works, ladies and gentlemen. So he's clearly not reading the literature, how cultural diffusion works. He seems to think, he uses the examples, this is the example he uses, that Leviathan, which is this Middle Eastern enemy deity, this villain, sort of villain being, supernatural being. Leviathan is in the Old Testament. It gets sucked into the Old Testament. And he's saying, well, there's no reason why there should be Leviathan, or this is just a leftover. It's just a random grab that somehow survived. And during the syncretism between, I don't know what he means. Like, I'm assuming he means Judaism and Canaanite religion. This is wrong on so many levels. First of all, there was no syncretism. The Jews did not come from somewhere else. This is what the Jews claim in the Old Testament, but modern scholarship has long since refuted this narrative. But we know the Hebrews were Canaanites. They are Canaanites. So it's not that the Hebrews were syncretizing their religion with Canaanite religion. Their religion is Canaanite religion, right? So this isn't even syncretism. So the Leviathan is there because they're Canaanites. Right? It's like this idea that they have this false narrative that they put over it, that they're not Canaanites, that they came from outside and they came in and killed all the Canaanites and destroyed all their altars and stuff. We know from tons of evidence, and this is leading mainstream scholarship now, we know from tons of evidence that the Hebrews were just Canaanites. They were just a Canaanite tribe. They conquered a bunch of surrounding Canaanite tribes, and then they created a new false narrative to try and force a new religion, a new perspective on religion on their own population. And we know even that didn't work. So we have examples in the Old Testament of people still weeping for Tammuz. In other words, people aware of the Inanna Tammuz resurrection tale at the gates of Jerusalem, Jews doing this. So this is still Jerusalemites doing this, despite the fact that they're the top down, the kingly caste and so on is trying to force this new perspective, this fake religion that they've sort of conjured on people. But it's not a syncretism, it's an evolution. So like the new Hebrew religion is an evolution of Canaanite religion. It's not a syncretism with some foreign culture. If you want to look for syncretism with Judaism, you look at Zoroastrianism. So that's where we have a clear example where before the Persian conquest, before the Jews became subsumed under the Persian Empire and were exposed to the Zoroastrianism, which they might not have even been monotheists before the Zoroastrians came along. But whether that's the case or not, it doesn't matter. They did not, before the Zoroastrian influence, they did not believe in resurrection. They did not even believe really in an afterlife per se. They did not believe in like Satan as the enemy of God. The Satan for them was an agent of God. He's actually lived in heaven and did God's will. They did not believe in the apocalyptic view of the world, like this linear apocalyptic idea. That's Zoroastrian. Jews didn't have that idea. So there's all of these ideas of flaming hell, the idea of a flaming hell. All of this stuff comes from Zoroastrianism. And then you get the Judaism after that. The Judaism believes in apocalypticism. The Judaism believes in the general resurrection at the end of times. That believes in Satan as an enemy of God. For burning hell. All of these elements were not in Judaism before. They are a syncretism of Judaism and Zoroastrianism. And so the new Judaism, the Judaism that Christianity sprang from, is a syncretized religion. It's this merger where what happens is the certain Jewish theologians and thinkers take the ideas they like from Zoroastrianism, bring them into Judaism, and change them. They Judaize them, make them more suitable. So they will be different, but they clearly come from there. There's no such thing as leftovers. They don't pick things up by accident, right? Like there's no leftovers. That's not how syncretism works. The only things that enter are the things they want. There's a reason. Everything gets sucked up for a reason, and it gets transformed to fit for a reason. Everything. There's no such thing as leftovers. So I don't even know where he gets this idea. It doesn't come from any of the literature on syncretism. It's not how syncretism works. So for him to claim that we should see leftovers, whatever he means, in the syncretized version of the resurrection story that we get for Jesus is just a false. There's no scholarly basis for this. There's no historical basis for this whatsoever. If what he means is we should see more parallels, like there should be more adaptations of these other resurrection stories in the Jesus story, we have that. And I noticed in there they claim that there aren't any. No, there are. I mean, look at Richard Miller's book. Miller's a PhD now who studied under Dennis MacDonald at Claremont Colleges. He wrote this book, and I cite it in Historicity of Jesus, on how the Romulus story is very clearly emulated in Mark's resurrection narrative for Jesus. So there's a lot of parallels. Now they're changed. They're used in different ways. The messaging is different. That's the point, right? So Mark is taking the ideas that he likes, porting them onto Jesus, and then transforming them and making a coherent narrative out of them that sells the story that Mark wants to sell. It's not random. It's not accidental. It's not just like, he's not just copying Romulus. That's not what syncretism does. That's not what Mark is doing. But again, here I'm talking about the Gospels, right? This is different from the origin of the religion. But even so, you can make the same point with the origin of the religion. They clearly are only going to adapt the things that they like and that they can Judaize, that they can change in a way that'll make it fit Judaism. So they take, the standard of all mystery religions, they all have communal meals where you share in the presence of the God to gain the salvation that the God offers. Well, what do the Christians do? Well, they take this, they have the communal meal that does the same thing, it shares the presence of the God and secures your salvation, etc. But they take the Passover, the Jewish Passover concept, and merge them. And so we get the Christian Eucharist, which is a merger of the Eucharist, of the Passover concept and this generic mystery cult communion idea. So they have communion from outside the religion. They have Passover from inside the religion. And they change them both to fit the way they want. They change the outside stuff to be more Jewish. What you get is the Eucharist. That's how syncretism works. And there's no leftovers. It's what's in there is just what they wanted to be in there. What's changed is stuff they wanted to change. They changed it on purpose. So if you can't say like it's different, therefore it can't have been influenced, that's not how syncretism works. Syncretism always transforms what is brought in. So it will be different. All syncretized religions are going to be different from the religions they borrowed from. So you can't use the difference argument either. That's a stupid argument that completely ignores how syncretism works, completely ignores the entire anthropology of religion and so on. So this is another example of it. You're just not reading the literature. They're not following up on how scholarship actually studies religion, and they're acting like they're making these declarations about how this stuff works without looking at any of the other comparable examples. All the other religions we've studied, you can look at how syncretism works is very clearly mapped out in all these other religions. The difference argument would be absurd. Like scholars would laugh you off the stage if you were to use this difference argument in any other religion. It only somehow becomes respectable in Christianity because now we have Christian apologetics that have to deny this, that Christianity is just like every other religion in the world, that it evolved just like every other religion in the world, that it was influenced by other religions just like every other religion in the world, that it was syncretized just like every other religion in the world. Christians can't handle this. What frustrates me is when secular atheists start aping Christian apologetic arguments. There's no reason for them to do that. They should look at how the history and study of religions works generally and admit that Christianity is just like every other religion. It'll have the same evolution, the same change, the same way it formed. All of this stuff is going to be the same because it's just a religion. It's just one other religion. So it's going to follow the same anthropology, the same sociology. And anyone who denies this is just denying reality. Like they're not they're trying to make an exception out of Christianity as if it's somehow weirdly different from all other religions, and it's just not in any relevant way. So
right. It's funny that you kind of seamlessly worked into that, because that's actually my next set of notes is parallels stuff, because they literally say in this video that there are no common practices among pagan religions, like there's no paralleled like pagan practices in Christianity. And I mean, you laid out the one major one, that being the Eucharist and the ritualistic,
right,
meals.
yeah, and they would say, now this isn't what they do in the video, but they would say like, oh no, that just comes from the Passover. It's like, well, actually, there are elements of it that are weirdly different from Passover, and when you isolate those elements, it's okay. Here's the things they've done a little differently. When you isolate those elements, what do those look like? They look exactly freaking like all the other communion rituals and the other mystery cults. So it's kind of a dead giveaway. What's happening here is that they're taking the ideas from other mystery cults that they like, they're merging them with a Jewish version of it and making a Jewish version of it. So so it's that's how syncretism works. If you want to understand how Christians are doing this, that's how they're doing it. They're not just like rubber stamping a copy. They're just like taking a religion from a foreign religion and just copying it. Like, that's not what they want to do. It's not what they actually are doing. That's not what we're claiming they've done. So if you want to understand what's going on, you have to really understand how syncretism works, which means you have to go look at how it worked in other religions. And then you can start to understand what we're talking about. I think, though, I have to say, even O'Neill at one point does say that there are some legitimate parallels, although he doesn't give any examples. So clearly he's somewhat movable on that point, I guess. I don't know. But they were only focusing on the shit that they wanted to mock, I guess.
Right. Well, I did hear, if I'm correct, I did hear Chris say that most of the parallels that are written about in your book are actually because of I can never say this.
Parallelomania.
Yeah.
Parallelomania. Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I just liken it to mostly parallelomania. Most of the time, it's just people seeing what they want to see.
Well, I'm wondering. I mean, what do you think about that? Because I mean, I read up on parallelomania and how things look similar, but they're not really parallels. And I'm just kind of curious if you could talk about the distinguishing thing between parallelomania and like actual parallels, or if the parallelomania is just like some kind of Christian apologetic. Because I don't know. I kind of got the feeling that it's like, oh, these aren't really parallels. They're just made up parallels. Like, it kind of felt like that kind of argument.
I mean, yeah, they are all made up in this. I see what you mean. Made up today, not made up.
Right.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Parallelomania is this view of finding anything that's even remotely similar and just therefore assuming that it's influenced, which is invalid. Like you need there has to be. So give you an example. Like, to find parallels is when you find a systematic structure of things being paralleled. So like the example of the Eucharist, where you have there are several elements of it that are like the communion rituals of mystery religions, and then elements of it that are like the Passover. And then you can see that when you mix them together, you get the Eucharist. So if you were to look at each individual parallel in isolation, that wouldn't be significant. Like, if it's just one thing, like, that could just be coincidence. But when you have several things together, all linked to the same concept, both inside and outside the religion, the statistical probability of that being an accident is so low. Like, that's how we know it's influence. And this is, I want to point out, this is, again, what we do in every other religion. This is how we know, how Islam, we know, probably derived in some sense from a Torah observant Christianity, because halal is basically kosher. It's an evolution of kosher. So they've basically come from some Christian tradition, because it's clearly they have it's a post-Jewish Christian basis, coming from some Christian tradition that was still Torah observant, and we know there were such sects in the Middle East. So you can show that influence. There's no way that they would just randomly invent halal and, oh, look, by weird coincidence, it just happens to be almost exactly like kosher. It's just coincidence. It's not influence. Obviously, it's influence, right? Halal is an evolution of kosher concept through some sort of channels or traditions. So it's the structure. When you have a whole structure that gets pulled in, the probability of that by accident is too low. And I point this out many times on the Historicity of Jesus. Every time I say there's a parallel, if you look, for example, in Mark's narrative of Jesus ben Ananias, is the narrative of this prophet in the 60s who gets killed by an artillery or by rock from Jewish or from a Roman catapult. The narrative has 20 points of similarity with the Jesus narrative in Mark, and all in the same order. And many of them are very peculiar. Like they're not like random, not like generic things. Some of them were generic things, but some of them are not. The probability of all 20 in that same order matching between the two stories is so low. Like it's not reasonable to believe that Mark wasn't using the Jesus ben Ananias story to model his story about Jesus ben Joseph, right? And I'm not the only one to say this. There's multiple scholars have said this under peer review. I cite them in the book. So even scholars who don't want to believe it admit, like, well, okay, yeah, looks like it could be influence. Can't prove it, but I don't know. Like it's curious, you know. So the point being is that's an example of where like you need that kind of structural copying to get it. It's not just random, pointless parallels that just happen to exist. And an example of a parallel that I wouldn't harp too much on, for example, is the third day. Jesus dies and rises on the third day. Now, here's an example. You can find third day motifs in all resurrection cults, not all, but many of them. It's in Osiris, it's in Adonis cults, and so on. It's very common. However, it was widely common in death cult lore generally. So, for example, in Jewish lore, after 3 days, the corpse is rotted so much that the soul can't recognize it anymore, and then that's what finally releases the soul into the afterlife. There's many other examples of dying and rising concepts or resurrection or death concepts that relate to the 3-day motif. Could have come from anywhere. It doesn't necessarily mean it came from mystery cults, for example. I mean, it might have, but we can't prove it in that case because there's many other ways it could have gotten in to the story. And it could even come from scripture. There's like scriptural basis, but even the scriptural basis likely comes from the same death lore from all over the place. Like the idea that we would rise again on the third day was probably just a widely believed idea of how death and vivification works and so on. So that's one that would be a weak parallel if it was just by itself. But if we have a whole structure of things together, then it starts to become less probable that it's accident. So that's how you handle those arguments. But you do need to make sure that the parallels you're finding really did exist. You really need to be able to show that they predate Christianity and they didn't come the other way. So like the Krishna Christ parallels I find are terrible because they come from texts long after Christian influence in India. So I don't know. I'm not a Sanskrit expert. I'm not an expert in Indian languages and culture, so I can't answer this question. But you can't just assume that the parallels between Krishna and Christ are the result of Krishna having them first. It might have been the other way around. Like Christianity may have influenced Indian religion, and it may have adopted things. I'm not saying that happened. I'm just saying you would have to rule that out first. So there's a lot of correct procedures you have to follow that makes what you're doing legitimate and not parallelomania. It only becomes parallelomania when you're not following those legitimate controls on how you're deciding which parallels are relevant and what they mean causally and so on.
Right. So what I get from here is that they've got to be like substantial in number, and then they got to follow a pattern. And the more instances of these paralleled elements that you have in a specific order that matches another like specific order from someplace else, that strengthens the parallel. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And it does come down to probability. So you can have a single parallel that's significant, but it has to be really weird, right? So like it has to be so specific that there is no plausible explanation for how that would be the same except for influence. So you basically have to say, like, what is the probability that someone would just come up with this independently by accident twice? If that probability is low, then you're probably looking at a parallel. Probably looking at influence, what I should say, some sort of influencer or something like that, or an emulator. Sometimes what they're doing, if you look at Dennis MacDonald's book on Mark's emulation of Homer, and also Dennis MacDonald also wrote a book on Mark's emulation of not Mark, but all the Gospels, emulation of the Septuagint. In both cases, the significance is looking at why they were doing it. What does this tell us? So they'll take things and change them on purpose because they want to sell a different message. And so they're assuming that you will at least some level of your psyche recognize the message that you're changing, and then get the point of what your different message is, like what you're saying differently. So it's a form of language, really, taking these mythemes and rejiggering them and changing them and using them a certain way is a form of language, a form of symbolic, sort of highly abstract language about how you're going to communicate with your public. And so it doesn't, like, for example, the fact that Mark was making Jesus emulate Odysseus in many ways, the point of Mark's point was not that Jesus was Odysseus or that Jesus was just like Odysseus. Mark's point is that Jesus is not like Odysseus. So he's taking all these parallels with Odysseus and then changing the stories to communicate, like, this is how Jesus is different from Odysseus, right? And it didn't have to be Odysseus. It's just any generic Gentile hero. The whole Mark's point is our hero is different. Here's how and why. And he'll use familiar motifs, familiar literary and mythical motifs to communicate this point. And so that's what they're doing. They're not just like, oh, I'm just going to copy Odysseus because I'm lazy. Like that's not what they're doing. Or you know, it's like, I can't think of anything on myself, so I'm going to invent a story about Jesus. I'm just going to borrow Odysseus and jigger it up. That's not what they're doing. They're doing it on purpose. It's a form of language, right? And you won't understand what the gospel authors are doing. You won't understand any writing in the gospels if you don't understand this fundamentally. You really got to understand, what are they doing as authors? And this is very clearly what they're doing. And many scholars have pointed it out. Thomas Brodie has famously done studies on this. Many other scholars have. Even Bart Ehrman has hinted at and referenced some of this. We know John Crossan. Crossan did a whole book on this. The Power of Parable is another example. So Randall Helms, Gospel Fictions is another example. Purvo did the book on Acts. It's similar. So a lot of scholars have pointed this out. Like, wait, this isn't new stuff I'm making up. But you do have to understand what the authors are doing and not treat parallelism as simply just, oh, we're claiming they just randomly, lazily borrowed stuff. Like that's not what we're claiming. That's not what happened. And so if you want to understand the actual claim, you have to like pay attention to what it is we're actually saying and what it is we're not saying. And that's why you have to distinguish, you know, like the cranks like Atwill and Akaria S. from serious scholars like myself and Lataster and even Price. Like if you want to get, you've got to separate these two and stop pretending that it's all the same thing. Like it's all parallelomania. No, it's not. Some of it is, yes, but not all of it is. Some of it is legitimate, actual arguments for influence. And to be fair, I do think in this video, O'Neill makes this point himself. There's a point where he says, the virgin birth mytheme. I think he does a little bit about the virgin birth mytheme, where I think I agree with him on it. Where he even mentions, like, it's a syncretism of Jewish ideas and pagan ideas of births of heroes, many miraculous births of heroes. They're not all virgin births, but there's the idea of a miraculous birth. The idea that it would be sexless is especially attractive to Jews who are very, attractive to these particular countercultural Jews, I should say, that the Christians came from. They're very anti-sex. So the idea that God would involve sex in any way is abhorrent. So if they're going to borrow a miracle narrative, they want to make Jesus look like a miracle hero like all the other Gentiles. He wants to make him look as great as all of them, or tell a different message about the miraculous birth of Jesus than for the other heroes. They're going to borrow elements from the sexless stories. So the biggest parallels are in the ones that don't involve sex. So there's many. There's several examples. I have another article, The Virgin Birth, It's Pagan, Guys, Get Over It. You can find on my blog that does the same thing. It shows that the mytheme very clearly does come from all around them. And this brings me to another point, is both with dying and rising gods and the virgin birth, or I should say like the sexless, let's call it sexless birth is a better way to put it, is what's really going on here. The virginity of the woman is actually kind of irrelevant, but it's the miraculous aspect of it is that it was no sex was involved. And that's where you find more parallels with. So the resurrection narrative and the miraculous birth narrative, these things are all over. Surrounding Judea, there's everywhere. There's at every neighboring province. They're just flying all over the place. They're crossing in and out Judea as Gentiles crossing in and out Judea, and the whole deal. And as pilgrims are bringing them with them, Jewish pilgrims from the diaspora are coming to Jerusalem and bringing this stuff with them. It's all over the place. But if you go look at China, you go look at India, around the same dates, it's about as best we have in terms of literature, these ideas didn't exist. It's just not a common everywhere trope. Like, I don't even think you'd find any resurrection narrative in ancient China. It only starts to appear after Christian influence. But before that, around Han China, there's no resurrection narratives. There's no dying and rising gods. There's no like proliferation of miraculously born heroes either. So when you compare those two, and then Han China was a great empire, very similar. It's kind of similar economic and technological level of achievement of ancient Rome. So it's really good, control. Like, so if you see that all these stories are just wildly popular in the Roman Empire and are nowhere, as rarely ever to be seen in the Chinese Empire, well, then you've ruled out it's just random accident, right? Like there's if you see that if Judaism rises and right in the center of where all this stuff is super popular, and bam, suddenly they have the exact same ideas. Well, it's kind of obvious where they came from, right? It can't just be just random. Well, just anybody could have thought of that. If that was true, they'd be all over China too, but they weren't. So this is how you can also show influence. It's like when a religion grows up in the midst of a garden full of a specific flower, and suddenly this religion is waving the same flower around. You just can't deny that there's an influence there. That's obviously what happened. And so doing the cross-cultural comparison is important as well.
One of the things that they said, and that I've encountered, but it was said in this particular video that we're discussing, is this whole need for an exact copy of a story in order for it to be paralleled. Like I know Tim O'Neill talks about it a little bit in it, about how, well, if Jesus did all of these things that this other supposed person did, that would make it more interesting.
And most of the ones that we do get cited, as you just used with that example of Zalmoxis, either didn't die or did die but didn't rise. Or Osiris is the classic example of did die but didn't rise. Somehow we're supposed to see the resurrection, in inverted commas, of Osiris as a parallel with Jesus. Well, I must have missed the bit where Jesus dies, gets eaten by fish, has his body put back together by his wife, who then straps a dildo on it and impregnates herself with their son. I'm pretty sure I would have been much more interested in Christianity if it had shit like that in the Bible, but my Bible was missing that stuff.
They seem to need this exact copy of a story in order for it to be a parallel. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what you think about that.
I mean, it just reiterates everything I was just pointing out. Is like, that's massively amateurish of them to think that. That's not how any scholarship in literature, how any scholarship in the evolution and syncretism of religion, no scholarship would think such an absurd thing. That's just not how it works. And everyone who's studying religions everywhere else knows that's not how it works. So why do they not know that that's not how it works? I mean, it's even illogical in a sense. Like, if it was identical, it would be the same story. Like, it's almost like they want to say, like, word for word, Plutarch's biography of Romulus with the name Jesus swapped in for Romulus. It's like, that's what they think is going to happen. It's like, no one would do that. That's not the point. Like, and that's not what they're doing. So it's a misunderstanding of how syncretism works. It's a misunderstanding of how literature and myth get made. And it's like they don't know anything about how mythology evolves and how cultural diffusion works within the mythosphere and so on. They're just not looking at parallel examples, by which I mean other religions. How do other myths evolve? What can we learn from that about how Christianity evolved? And that's the only way to do this correctly. And they're just not doing it that way. And if you want to look at other religions, what you see are things like what we're talking about, which is you have a few elements get drawn in and they get transformed and changed. Always. That's always what happens. Because your religion is, if it's different from the other religion, you want to sell it as different from the other religion. So you are going to change it. Like that's just how it works. So it's like they think that the Christians just want to copy a foreign religion and just emulate it and be just like it. But that would be stupid. They would just join the religion if that was the case, right? Like if they were that enamored with Osiris cult, they'd just become Osiris worshippers. That's not what they're doing. They're saying, and the same with if you look at Zoroastrianism, like why didn't the Jews just convert to Zoroastrianism? Why did they transform? Why did they borrow ideas from Zoroastrianism, merge them with Hebrew ideas, and create a whole new religion that's different from Zoroastrianism, but has all of these scattered elements in it that are relevant as a structure? Because they don't want to be Zoroastrians. They want to be better than Zoroastrians. And so they're taking all the things that they think made Zoroastrianism look better than Judaism, sucking them into their religion and claiming that those things are theirs, and then claiming to have a better religion. Like that's the whole way syncretism works, right? It works with the cargo cults. I have an example in Element 29 in Chapter 5 of On the Historicity of Jesus is another example. That's a modern anthropological example of how this works, of how local island culture and religion was merged with foreign imperialist Christian religion to create a whole new religion that they claim is better than both, right? So that's how syncretism works. So yeah, this idea that it should be a carbon copy with just names changed or whatever is not how any of this ever works in the history of religion, and therefore they're just not understanding what we're talking about, or what the precedents are, or what the models are for how religion evolves and develops, basically.
Right. Do you think that it could be the whole nuance issue that they seem to have? Like they don't get, I guess they don't get the nuance between, mythicists saying, oh, well, these are paralleled, like this is paralleled in Christianity. They immediately, like they totally don't hear the whole parallel or what parallels mean, and they just hear, oh, it's a copy. Like, it's like they hear an echo in their head, like, oh, Jesus is copied from Horus. Like, it doesn't matter what you actually say or what you're actually talking about. They have this preconceived notion in their mind about what you're meaning or whatever, and then they answer that, or they refute that straw man.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There are mythicists who do that. I mean, Akaria S. and Atwill are actually doing that stupid thing that they're reacting to a real thing. So those are legitimate criticisms. But where they're going wrong is assuming that all mythicists are doing that. Right. So like they're assuming that I'm doing that. I'm not doing that. If you read my book, you'd know I'm not doing that. And so that's the mistake. Yeah, it's the black and white fallacy all over again. It's either all true or all false. It's either all sound or all ridiculous. There's no like middle ground of actually some of this is correct. And you're right. Yes, some of it is incorrect as well. Both of those things are true. And they do seem to have a really hard time finding that coherent middle ground where reality exists. So they're stuck at the extremes and can't find their way to what the actual facts are in the middle of it all. So yeah, I do think that's the case. I mean, there was a point where I think, O'Neill said there were tropes that existed and influenced Christianity, but he says there's a difference between influence and derivation. He never says what the difference is, so I don't know. I don't know what he means. What is the difference between influence and derivation? I don't see a difference there, but it may reflect the fact that he thinks there's a difference, may reflect the fact that he doesn't understand how syncretism has operated in religions generally, and consequently he's incapable of applying that model to Christianity because he doesn't understand the model, and which means he doesn't understand the anthropology of religion, he doesn't understand the sociology of religion, doesn't understand the history of literature and mythology. And that's going to be a problem. Like, you're not going to understand what we're talking about if you don't understand those things, if you're not willing to listen and learn. And I think that's what people need to do. People on both sides, actually, not just the critics of mythicism, but even mythicists need to learn this too, so that they don't go around aping the bad shit. Like, I constantly get the Horus-Jesus comparison thing all the time. It's especially since it's stuck in Religulous. The movie Religulous does the Jesus-Horus comparison. I just facepalm when I see that. So it's really annoying. So there's definitely mythicists need to rein themselves in too. They need to learn how this stuff really works as well. In other words, the people like O'Neill are really criticizing, who really do deserve this criticism, are part of the problem, because they're actually creating the sort of nemesis that is pissing O'Neill off and getting him making him fly off the handle. And they're causing O'Neill to ignore all the serious mythicism and just assume it's all the same. And so the mythicists who are getting it wrong are also a problem, and do also have to learn how all the things we just talked about in this video, like, they need to get it too. But still, that's not an excuse for not paying attention to how we're different and what we're saying. So yeah, no, I totally agree. But that's kind of what I meant by them unable to grasp nuance, is they can't really distinguish between crackpot mythicism and like legitimate, like, yeah, truly. Yeah, that's true. And so I was just looking at my notes again. So they had a whole section where this is another example where they go on about how like they admit, as all sane people would, that the Gospels are full of myth. Like a lot of it's made up stuff, like they know. Some of it might even be influenced by other religions. There's just on the cusp of being able to admit that. But they said, well, there's still some history you can extract, right? But they don't seem, so for example, they went off a lot on the baptism by John the Baptist as this example that was conjured by Christian apologists in the mid 20th century and sort of filtered into mainstream mainstream scholarship of Christianity. It's completely unfounded. Like there's really good peer-reviewed scholarship pointing out that there's actually nothing embarrassing at all about Mark's version of the John the Baptist baptism scene. In fact, it's the opposite of that. It's very clearly made up. It's definitely what Mark wants to happen. He has this famous baptizer have Jesus represent what a baptism is, and then openly declare Jesus his superior and successor. That's exactly the story that Mark would make up, right? There's no reason why that would be true. It's probably false. And there's many elements of it that are probably false. Like the fact that it occurs in the Jordan is an example that they're missing. Like when you look at the passage on John the Baptist and Josephus, there's no mention of him baptizing in the Jordan. There's no particular reason why he would be baptizing in the Jordan specifically. So why is it happening there? Well, Mark's narrative, if you look at it, it is a reversal. And many scholars have pointed this out. It is a reversal of the desert narrative, the wandering Jews narrative from the Exodus. In the Exodus, the Jews are wandering in the desert, and they're miraculously fed and so on, and they suffer many temptations and they fail. They basically fail the tests, and that results in them being stuck in the desert extra long. That's why they're there for 40 years, yada yada. And then finally they get to the Jordan, and the original Jesus, Joshua, it's the same name, people don't know. The original Jesus parts the Jordan, and the Jews run into Palestine and conquer, and so on. And that's the narrative, right? The Jesus narrative, Jesus goes to the Jordan, essentially parts the Jordan by baptism, right? Symbolically, he's parting the Jordan, although the word parting goes into the heavens. So it says when Jesus is being baptized, the heavens parted, right? So, and then where does Jesus go? He goes the opposite direction. He goes into the desert, where he is tempted, just like the Jews were, in the same temptations. They're similar themed temptations. But he passes the test, right? And so what he has done is he's undone the curse that the Jews caused themselves in the Exodus by basically fixing what they broke. And then Jesus goes on his mission and so on. This is classic myth. Like this is just right out of anyone who studied mythology in any other religion and any other culture recognizes what's going on here. So, oh yeah, that's exactly how people write myths. It's clearly made up. It's an elegant narrative that's serving a purpose and a message and so on. So there isn't any basis at all for believing that John the Baptist story is true. And this constant repeat, it was embarrassing. There's no way Mark would make it up. It's like, you aren't reading the text. Like you aren't paying attention to what Mark is doing with this text, and you're making false claims about it. And now I've written all of this in Proving History. I have a whole section in my book, Proving History, on the methodology of why we can't extract history from the Gospels. And many scholars agree with me. In fact, every scholar who has written a peer-reviewed study of the criteria, the method of criteria, has concluded these criteria are broken and don't work. And I cite them all and so on in the book, but I have a whole section on John the Baptist. It's clear that O'Neill and Chris and the others did not read it. They're unaware, not only of what I've written on it, they're unaware of what the other scholars I cited have written on it. They don't know what they're talking about. And I find this happens a lot, even in like PhD professor advocates of history. James McGrath, for example, would do this. Even Bart Ehrman will do this, is they just ape the old John the Baptist narrative. Oh, it's embarrassing, therefore it must be true. It's like, did you fact check that? Like you're just repeating what someone told you. You're not checking it. And if you check it, you'll find out that it actually doesn't hold up. It actually is clearly made up, and it's obviously in Mark's interest. It's not embarrassing at all. Now, later gospel authors like Matthew and Luke didn't like Mark's version of the story, so they started changing it. But that just means that Matthew and Luke were embarrassed by Mark's story. It doesn't mean Mark was embarrassed by the story. And the argument for historicity requires that the originator of the story be embarrassed by it. Because if he's not embarrassed by it, there's no longer any reason for it to be historical. And so finding that later authors were embarrassed by the fiction that Mark made up does not say anything about it not being fiction. That's a fallacy. It doesn't make any logical sense to argue that way. So when you actually go looking at how these arguments work in the literature, they're terrible. Like they have no logical validity. They're not paying attention to the facts. Even in mainstream scholarship, this happens. And so you really you can't just repeat what someone told you. You actually got to check. And if you want to check in the best way, you go find their best critics, which would be like me and the scholars I cite, and compare. Like say, look at the critics, look at what the people advocating say. Well, who's missing facts? Who's getting things wrong? Who's using fallacies? Who's not? And that's how you figure out which between the two of us is right. You have to actually do the work. You can't just ape what someone says because you agree with them, and you're not even going to fact check whether they were right. That's another example of how I think methodology is completely backwards and broken in the way they're approaching this. And that's what I just described is the way you should be doing it. If you're a critic of mythicism, you still need to do the best devil's advocate argument. It's like, okay, well, I heard this argument about John the Baptist. Let's see what the counter arguments are, which counter arguments come not just from mythicists, even from historicists. Peer-reviewed historicists have counter arguments. So if you want to find the best counter arguments, you go find them and you compare and you do the work. And then you make a rational decision, like who's got the evidence, who's using fallacies. Like this is how it should be done. And I would be much happier if Tim O'Neill and Chris and the others would actually start doing methodologically sound work like that. If you're going to do a video, especially if you're going to bore us for 3 hours on ranting on this stuff. But, speaking of, I suppose we should wrap soon so we don't go too long. But I think we've hit most of the points I wanted to do. There's like little things that, like they have a whole section on Galilee and Nazareth where I kind of agree. I actually agree with them. I don't know if they know that I agree with them. But I agree that like the argument that Nazareth didn't exist is a terrible argument. It might not have existed, but I don't think so. I think it probably did. And the arguments for René Salm, who's a piano teacher, doesn't know what he's talking about, for example, they're terrible arguments. Now gets to the nuance point, right? It's like it's not black or white. René Salm did get a peer-reviewed critique of the Nazareth archaeology in a peer-reviewed journal. He did actually do that. And he did have legitimate criticisms of some of the archaeology. But the fact that some of the archaeology was shoddy does not mean Nazareth didn't exist, right? So like it's this leap. So René Salm is making the false leap that some of the work is bad, therefore all of it's false, therefore Nazareth didn't exist. Fallacy. It's not how it works. You can have archaeology that proves Nazareth existed, some of which is shoddy. Yeah, that can happen, right? So it's not the correct conclusion. But the same way, Chris and O'Neill do the exact same opposite black and white fallacy, where they go, well, it must therefore there's nothing shoddy about Nazareth archaeology. It's all correct. And there's an example. What Chris said, I wrote it somewhere here. All right, what did he say? He said that he contacted the excavators of a farmhouse claimed to be near Nazareth. And that they confirmed that oh yeah, it was definitely there in the first century and so on. And he cites this with great pride as like, yes, we've confirmed Nazareth. It's ridiculous to suggest Nazareth didn't exist. And I'm like, well, I agree with your conclusion, but not from that premise. I think there are good arguments. They didn't bring up any of the good arguments. The best argument is the priestly resettlement inscriptions. There are these inscriptions that actually mention priests that had to leave the temple when it was destroyed in the year 70 because they used to live in the temple. So it got destroyed in the war. They were resettled in a variety of towns. And so they actually list the families of priests and what towns they're settled in. And this is in Hebrew or Aramaic. It's we have more than one of these inscriptions, but we only have one complete one, or one that has the Nazareth on it. One of the towns is Nazareth. And so that means that Nazareth existed by 70 AD, and it was large enough to take in a caste of priests. So I don't see any argument that Nazareth didn't exist in the 30s AD. Like, it just doesn't hold up. But at the same time, I have to really call gullibility on Chris here. Like, he talked to some excavators of a random farmhouse in a field somewhere that's not even in Nazareth, right? So how is that? It's not like the excavators found a sign on the house that said this house is a part of the district of Nazareth. Like, so it's not even, that's fallacious. He's being just as fallacious as René Salm in trying to say that we definitely know Nazareth existed because we found a farm somewhere. Like that's not. It was near the modern town of Nazareth. We don't even know that the modern town of Nazareth is the ancient Nazareth. I mean, and even if it was, the farmhouse sitting outside of it does not confirm that the town was there. Like there are farms everywhere in the ancient world, right? So, anyways, it's just bad logic on both sides. I find that frustrating. Like there's no reason for this, and to be so arrogant and mocking about it is just even more embarrassing, I think.
No, yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, yeah, we definitely did, because I did have some notes on here where they mentioned like the Nazareth and stuff, which, again, I think that this kind of, falls on the area of nuance, because like, the whole Nazareth not existing and everything like that, that's lumped into the whole mythicist argument in general, when I really don't hear a lot of mythicists like making that particular argument that like Nazareth didn't exist, that kind of thing. And it just kind of seems like they're convoluting every single mythicist argument together.
Yeah.
Because the entire point of this particular section was supposed to be criticizing, I thought, you, or maybe at least the peer-reviewed version of mythicism, and not just like taking the shit on mythicists in general and every single mythicist idea out there. One of the things that I did want to bring up, which I don't know if they, because I have this down as a note, I don't know if they brought it up in the actual video, but a lot of times I've heard that Philo of Alexandria uses phrases similar to Paul, but in different ways. So, like, the things that Philo says about his logos and everything like that was meant in a totally different way than Paul does it. So, Paul is not in any way connected. Like, like the ideas aren't connected, like, whatsoever.
Yeah, that's another black and white fallacy. That did not come up in the video. That was not. I know that I would have made a note if that had been the case. But no, that's another black and white fallacy, right? Like it's assuming that it's all one thing or all another thing. Like either Paul is literally just aping Philo, or he was not influenced by Philo whatsoever. And also it's not just Paul influenced by Philo. They both might be influenced by a previous author, right? So what we're seeing is ideas percolating up into Hellenized Judaism, basically. So the ideas probably predate both Philo and Paul, and we're seeing versions of them in different ones. So yeah, they're using them different ways. Philo's not a Christian. Paul is adapting things to his own religion. Philo is adapting things in his own way as well. But you can see that they both have common influence. It's similar, like the same way you would argue that the flood myths, right? You look at the Enuma Elish, or they have the Babylonian Sumerian flood myths and the Jewish, the Old Testament flood myth. Clearly, they're very different, but they clearly have influences. And in fact, you can see like later flood myths that were influenced as well. So you can see a pattern, and they're not going to be identical. But that's not what you need to prove influence. Influence involves influence and evolution, right? So you're going to see common ancestry, but you're also going to see change over time, and you'll see change in parallel too. So like species will co-evolve. That's why we have multiple different types of apes. We've got, apes, bonobos, chimpanzees. They've all evolved together at the same time in different directions. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a common ancestor. Obviously they do. And texts and ideas and mythemes work the same way. They can evolve from a common ancestor and change over time. And so they will change at the same rate in parallel to each other. So the fact that there are differences between Philo and Paul is not relevant. What's relevant is that the parallels between them are too numerous to be coincidence. So there's no way, just no way, in any plausible way, that these ideas came to Paul just spontaneously by accident, just happened to match things in Philo. Like, it's just not possible. Like, that's just a ridiculous thing to suggest. There's clearly been influence. There's also been change. So they are using them slightly differently. They're doing different things with them, but you can see the common ancestry behind them. That's another example of just doing bad scholarship and being sucked into this black and white fallacy where you can't see how reality works, because you can only see it's either this extreme or this extreme. You can't see reality, which is in the middle. And I find this, like, again and again, we've given many examples in this video of how O'Neill and Chris and stuff are doing that. Like, they just can't see reality because they're obsessed with there being only two versions possible, and they're not looking at the combined version in the middle, which is actually where reality usually sits on any of these questions.
Mm-hmm.
which I mean that's frankly a good place to wrap, I think, for this particular subject today.
Oh, no, yeah, definitely. And I appreciate you, Rick, for coming on and talking with me about this particular 3-hour stream. It's kind of hard to distill down everything, because I know we've spent like about an hour and a half now, discussing what they were talking about. And it's just amazing how like how much, we have to correct, just for a little bit, because this is only a little bit of their stream that they talked about this.
Yeah, and we'll split it up. So I'll come back on and we'll do the other half of the video with the ancient science and the ancient libraries and all that stuff too, because I have a lot to say about that. But it's a completely different subject, completely different books. So I've written books on those subjects as well. For people who want to find that, you'll have links, I guess, under the video. But yeah, it's just richardcarrier.info. Anybody can find all my stuff through there, all my feeds, anything you want. But yeah, it's been good to been able to have this chance to go over all of this stuff. And like I said, I'll probably write, after you've published your video, I'll probably write a companion blog for people.
Awesome. Yeah, that would be great, because I know that you can go into a lot more detail, in that than you can really here. So everybody, if you want to hit up the links that I have down in the description, I've got blog post links as well as links to Carrier's works. If you want to go down there and check those out, definitely do that. While you're down there, make sure you leave us a comment, smash the like button, and subscribe if you like this type of interview. And don't forget, stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.